And we want to welcome you to what should prove to be a very special and insightful webinar. It is a supreme honor to introduce a leader whose distinguished career spans diplomacy, finance, academia, and international business, Ambassador Robert D. Hormats, or as I'm allowed to say, Bob. Bob, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ambassador Hormats has served under 5 U.S. presidents, both Democrat and Republican, from Nixon through Obama, where he helped shape American economic diplomacy over 5 decades. Most recently, he served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment during the Obama administration. His public service began at the National Security Council in 1972, where he advised Dr. Henry Kissinger, General Brent Scowcroft, and Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski on foreign trade, energy, and monetary policy, playing a critical role in opening U.S.-China relations and navigating the global energy crisis of the 1970s. He held several senior positions within the State Department, including Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs, representing the U.S. in trade negotiations with China, India, Brazil, and the European Union. Additionally, Bob has held senior positions under the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. He has also served as U.S. delegate at multiple G7 economic summits. In the private sector, he spent over 25 years at Goldman Sachs, rising to vice chairman of Goldman Sachs International. There, he led efforts in global capital markets and advised governments on privatization and financial strategy. At the State Department, Ambassador Hormats championed Secretary Clinton's economic statecraft agenda, advancing American trade and investment by addressing intellectual property rights, trade barriers, and competition with state-owned enterprises. Beyond diplomacy and finance, Ambassador Hormats is also a scholar and educator, currently a visiting lecturer at the Yale School of Management and a former adjunct at Columbia and Princeton. He sits on multiple corporate and advisory boards, including the corporate board of American Tower, the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy, where he was formerly chairman, and Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation's Domestic Advisory Board. He's been recognized with France's Legion of Honor and Germany's Order of Merit for his contributions to international economic cooperation. Today, we are so fortunate to hear from someone who has not only negotiated trade policies at the highest level, but also guided businesses through its real-world impact. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Robert D. Hormats. Before we get started, I just want to point out that the Q&A feature in our webinar, please at any time submit questions through the presentations through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We will collate those and bring them up at the end of the webinar. A little note on Hollowbrook. We focus so much of our research and time on understanding global perspectives to inform the guidance we share with our clients. And the uncertainty of today is unprecedented. I can't think of anyone in our network who knows more about global trade than the gentleman who is before you. And it is, again, a supreme honor, Bob, to have you here with our friends and clients of Hollowbrook Wealth Management. I'm going to kick off with our first question. And so let's just start at the top. How would you define the goals of the administration today? What is happening with deficits, trade balances, and relations with China? And maybe what are we to expect from this?
Well, thank you very much, Philip. First, let me say what an honor and a pleasure it is to be with you and your colleagues at Hollowbrook. My respect for you and your colleagues and the amount of work you do and thought you give to these global issues and to the major changes that are underway is really enormous and very inspiring, because when you come up with judgments and ideas, they're really very well thought out, and you really do have a very good grip on what's going on both in the United States and abroad. So it makes it a real pleasure for me to work with you and to be here. I would say, in answer to your question, the Trump agenda is clearly multifaceted, but the one issue that tends to be most on people's minds these days is the tariff question. And I would say he's got several objectives. One objective clearly is to reduce the U.S. trade imbalances with a number of countries. Second, he wants to use some of the revenues, as much as he can, to offset the impact of tax cuts. Third, he wants to get other countries to play by the rules, to equate the American trade with them with their trade with the United States, the sort of objective of balance between the two countries, U.S.-China, U.S.-India, U.S. and various other countries. And fourth, there's a very important security component to it. Trade is now more and more not just about the numbers and the balance of payments, but it's about who sells what to whom and who buys what from whom. And there is a general view in the Trump administration that they do not want the United States to be dependent on China for critically important goods, either produced goods or raw materials. And actually, what makes it more difficult is the Chinese have a similar view. They don't want to be too dependent on the United States either. So what you're seeing is sort of a gradual decoupling, not in every area, but certainly in items that have to do with security. And we depend a lot on the Chinese for parts for many of our factories, and they depend on the United States for a wide range of things that go into making computers and all sorts of other high technology goods.
Great. So, Bob, what are we to expect with the recent announcement on trade tariffs, the backing and forthing? What do you think we should expect going forward?
I think we can expect a period of prolonged uncertainty. And I think one of the problems, and we'll talk about it a bit later, is the way execution takes place. The problem for a lot of companies, both big and small, is that they really don't know what the tariff is going to be 2 weeks from now, 2 months from now, 2 years from now. And planning is very difficult. How do you give guidance to the market, for instance, when you really don't know the cost of your inputs? How do you know how to plan for an environment where the tariff could be 50% or 10%? It's very hard. So you really don't know your cost structure. And I think we're going to see this as we go along. We're also going to see, I think, an attempt by the Trump administration to make some deals to demonstrate with other countries, and particularly demonstrate with the American people, that his policy is working. So far, what the American people have seen is the potential, and in some cases, the actual reality of higher costs for components and higher costs for the goods they get in the store. This is only just the beginning. So in order to offset that, the Trump administration needs to demonstrate that it is getting more open markets abroad for American products. The other thing that the president wants to demonstrate is that he is getting a fair amount of revenues from these tariffs to help to offset what he wants to be a period of tax cuts that he's promised during the campaign. The only problem is that in a way the two are mutually inconsistent, because if you make a deal with another country and you cut American tariffs, you're also cutting the availability of revenues that help offset the tax cuts that he wants to provide. So he has to do a balance between cutting tariffs to achieve trade objectives, but keeping some tariffs on to accrue a higher level of revenues to offset the tax cuts he wants.
Right. Bob, can we back up? You made a comment that indicated that trade and tariffs and a lot of these things that the administration has raised relates to national security, and that meaning that the ability to produce key important products, components, technologies here in the U.S. instead of relying on other countries, be it China or Europe or anywhere else. To what degree has that already started with the CHIPS Act, with the big investment that's going on in Arizona? And then even some pharmaceutical companies have recently announced, many, many $billion of investments in factories here in the Carolinas and abroad. How much of this is already in motion or been in motion prior to even the trade issues being raised by the administration?
Well, it's a very good point, Philip. That is really a key element for American strategy going forward. If you're very concerned about China as an adversary, you don't want to be reliant on the Chinese if there should be military action in the Western Pacific, vis-a-vis Taiwan or even some other countries. So the United States clearly does not want to be dependent on China for chips. We import a lot of pharmaceutical products from China. We import a lot of components in the pills we take, vitamin pills and antibiotics from China. We don't want to be dependent on them for that either. So we have tried to get companies to invest in some of these highly sensitive strategic items in the United States. And I think some foreign companies, semiconductor, for instance, is one, but there are many others that are and have been for the last several years developing an investment presence in the United States. And I think we can count on that more and more. And Trump has this notion, and to a degree it works, that if it looks like he's going to be erratic with respect to tariffs, that it will induce more countries to invest in the United States so they can avoid the impact of the tariffs. The only problem with that is while there may be more investment coming in from the rest of the world, Americans are having to pay higher prices for a wide range of goods, and this is going to continue. Don't forget, the tariffs have only just begun. And I think when people see that the things they buy at the grocery store or the cars they buy or many other things are going to be costing more, they're going to weigh the potential benefits of more investment, which take time to materialize, versus the immediate cost impact for goods to buy every day. So this is a balance. There's a saying in economics that the economics of tariffs benefit in the long term, but are painful in the short term. And that's really what we're seeing and we're going to see. And the uncertainty is costly as well, because people don't really know what the price structure is going to be. And therefore, many companies are reluctant to make big investment decisions if they really don't know the price structure of their components. So this is another cost. And the other is that there's retaliation. The Chinese have retaliated, and not just the Chinese, the Canadians, the Mexicans, the Europeans. So that affects a lot of American companies that depend heavily on exports. So there are costs and benefits, and there are short-term and long-term costs and short-term and long-term benefits. And measuring those, weighing those is a very difficult thing. And in addition, trade negotiations take a very long time. I was Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, and I can remember excruciatingly long negotiations. So you have a period of uncertainty, not knowing how long the negotiation is going to take. And that uncertainty is troublesome to a lot of countries.
So, Bob, can we elaborate on that and maybe drill down there? You said that negotiations in trade deals takes a long time. Historically, in your experience, were there ever times when trade deals happened at the pace at which the administration is hoping for? There's multiple deals on the table with many, many countries with differing economies, and there's talk of things being buttoned up by June, July. What's your take on that?
Well, it'd be a minor miracle if you can reach a negotiated agreement in detail in 2 months. I mean, from my point of view, the average going back for quite a number of years, is maybe in some cases 1 year, 2 years, 3 years even. If they do reach an agreement in a short period of time, it may be more symbolic than real, because a real trade agreement takes an excruciating amount of detail to determine what the tariff is for product A, which can be very different from the tariff for product B. So it takes a very long time, and you have to have hearings. You have to have a comment period from the industries that might be adversely affected or positively affected by the tariff. So you have to do a lot of consulting to do these properly with the industries that are affected, to understand how it affects the auto industry, how it affects a small manufacturer in Des Moines. A lot of consultation is required. And under the way the laws are written, you have to have consultations with the Congress, and you have to have consultations with various regulatory bodies. So the president has a lot of authority in the trade area, but once you get down to the details, there can be a lot of time spent with all these consultations to understand how what you do affects various companies in various sectors.
And so, Bob, most of today, what you've mentioned is China. Obviously, we all saw the trade balance equation that the administration put forth in those posters and the announcements the other day on Liberation Day. What about, is this really, from the administration standpoint, is this really mostly about China? I mean, Europe, yes, Japan, yes, but, Switzerland and some of these smaller countries, even Canada to a certain extent, is this really, honestly, mostly about China?
I think China is sort of the big kahuna here. China's the amount of trade between the United States and China really is enormous. We actually trade, believe it or not, more with Canada and more with Mexico than we do with China. China's only 3. And we are affected by what happens in Canada. They sell us a lot of energy. They sell us timber for housing. They sell us a lot of things. The Mexicans sell us a lot of manufactured goods. The auto industry, a number of companies are moving there. They sell us fruits and vegetables. So for the average American, those tariffs mean a lot, but they're not as large as the Chinese tariffs are, 145%, which is quite formidable, dwarfing tariffs for any other countries. And China does make a lot of components that American companies need: auto industry, the airplane industry, and many others. Plus, it's often forgotten that they make a lot of equipment that goes into factories in this country, and factories in this country depend heavily on equipment made in China. And as I mentioned earlier, they sell us a lot of pharmaceutical products. And they sell us about 16% of the imported pharmaceutical products that we import into this country. And they sell a lot to India, and we buy a lot from India. So I can't help but think that a lot of what's going on that does come here ultimately is rerouted from China to India to the United States, or China, Malaysia to the United States. So and these are important. I mean, they're not the overwhelming numbers. I mean, Ireland's a bigger supplier, Israel's a bigger supplier, India's a bigger supplier, but they're substantial, and they're in critical areas like antibiotics.
Right. Well, let's talk about execution. I've heard you mention on TV or in the media and other places that how something is executed matters more than what is done. What do you think about the execution of these goals and how the administration is executing here?
Well, I think the administration should have spent more time in determining an execution strategy before it announced these very bold objectives. It's okay to have bold objectives. I don't think they'll be able to obtain all the objectives, but having said that, I think they wanted to get a big impact by announcing very big objectives. The problem is that when you produce these big numbers, you don't have the background and you don't have the groundwork done to get the other country to go along with them. They're sort of overwhelmed by them because they're shocked by them, frankly. I'm sure the Chinese never expected 145% tariff from the United States. This has never happened before.
Right.
So the other part of that is the Chinese don't negotiate the way the United States does. They are a very different culture. They're a 4,000-year-old culture. They have their ways. And I've negotiated with a lot of Chinese over a lot of years, including President Xi Jinping and a number of his predecessors. And what is critical about the way the Chinese negotiate is they do not put their head of state out in a negotiation or even a phone call unless a lot of homework has been done at lower levels to make sure there is a firm agreement. The first three things the Chinese have asked of us is not about the numbers. The Chinese want to have a clear idea of what our objectives are. They want a person to be responsible on the American side for the negotiations. They don't want to be negotiating with the finance minister, the Secretary of the Treasury here and the Secretary of Commerce there. They want one organized negotiation because that's the way they do it. The third is, what's very important to them, is respect. In other words, a respectful relationship in dealing with them. That is very important to us. It may or may not sound important. To them, it does, given their culture and their history, and they want certainly respect for their head of state. So they want to make sure that everything is buttoned up in terms of procedure, and they want to make sure that when something is announced, it's announced by both countries, and the designated negotiator of the president negotiates and agrees with the designated negotiator of the president of China. They don't want something announced in Beijing and then the negotiator goes back and the president says, well, I don't really like this. We have to renegotiate it. The Chinese lose a lot of face when that happens. So when you're going to do it in an organized way, start at a lower level, build up, and do something that's firm and credible and is not going to be changed. When it's changed, the Chinese say, we've put ourselves on the line, you've changed it, and now we have to go back again. So our negotiator is embarrassed by bringing back something that was simply not accepted by the United States ex post.
Yeah. So Bob, obviously trust is really important in diplomatic matters. It's important in the treasury markets, in the bond markets. It's important in currency markets. Can you just share maybe a recent example from your diplomatic experience where execution either built trust or broke it?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's very relevant because during the last financial crisis, trust between the United States and China, and it was a while ago, so many people have forgotten, trust between the United States and China was actually quite high. And we worked with the Chinese to help get out of that crisis in terms of government stimulus, government spending, collaboration. And I was engaged in a lot of that, and the Fed worked with the People's Bank of China. Our Secretary of the Treasury worked with the Finance Ministry of China. There was a lot, because these were the two biggest countries. The Chinese owned a lot of American bonds, a lot of American currency, and we needed the Chinese and they needed us. They didn't want the system to fall apart. We didn't want it to fall apart. So that trust, because these had been people who worked together in the past, they knew one another and they knew they could trust one another. It was very important. You know, Hank Paulson, people like that, had been there a lot. The Chinese finance minister had made numerous trips to the United States. So that trust was critically important. My concern now is with all that's going on currencies, the bond market, a whole range of uncertainties, we are vulnerable to having another financial crisis. I'm not predicting that, but I don't think you can rule it out. And the question is, which countries will be the leaders in organizing the effort to get out of it. And would the countries trust the United States to do it? Would the United States want to do it as it has in the past? So that trust factor that was so prevalent and so important in the last crisis really needs to be reinstilled in the relationship between the United States and China, and the United States and numerous other countries, in order to get out of any future crisis that might occur. And you know, we always, almost every 20 years, have a financial crisis, and it takes countries, leaders, respected people on all sides. One country can't do it. Lots of countries have to, and they have to trust one another to work on it and to succeed.
So I think, Bob, what's really on the front of the minds of our clients on this call, on our friends, on the audience as a whole, is how does one prepare for the outcomes of today's plan, and what risks should we all consider?
Well, I think, you know, I know a lot of people at Hollowbrook are thinking about this and working with your clients on this. I think that it is very important. It's very hard to predict with a high degree of precision what is going to happen. My view is that making firm and hard predictions probably is not a useful practice at this point, because things can change. Individuals' points of view can change, the markets. Who would have thought that the treasury market and the currency market here would have reacted the way they did? That surprised a lot of people. That can happen in a lot of countries, not just our own. But I think it's very important to sit down and develop potential strategies for dealing with potential eventualities or potential scenarios that could happen. And Churchill said, planning is useless. Plans are useless, but planning is essential. Yeah. And what he was really getting at was a given plan itself might not work, but the fact that you're engaged in a planning and a strategic process whereby Americans and people from other countries work together to figure out what you would do under one possibility or another possibility or a third possibility is very important, because those could happen. So the fact that you're engaging in a planning process, even if the exact plan is not going to work, the fact that you're engaging in an effort to try to work yourselves out of a problem is important. And I also think that agility is important. You can't follow the market and flip with every change in the market. You'd be, you know, your head would be spinning. But I think having a diverse portfolio is important. Keeping an eye on what's going on is important. Having advisors who are not just looking at what's happening today, but are looking at what could happen a month from now or 2 months from now or 2 days from now. So people who've been through these experiences before can say, well, the odds of the bond market deteriorating further is, let's say, 20%, 30%, just to make up a number.
Yep.
Or the odds of certain economies operating in a way that surprises you. You have to be prepared for that. And I think that thinking things through, looking over the corner, over the horizon or around the corner is very important, just to be, so you're not surprised by what happens, and you have in the back of your mind or on paper a strategy for dealing with it if it does happen.
It's funny you say that, Bob, because I was thinking the other day, we had our investment committee meeting at the firm, and I'd say for the last 20 years, one of the top items for discussion at every week's investment committee meeting is liquidity, because liquidity is an assumption in markets until it's just not nowhere to be found. Right. And so this is a moment in time where all the things you said, you know, having diversification and risk control, but liquidity for us is a paramount part of portfolio construction for all seasons, but particularly in this kind of environment where there's this much global uncertainty.
Philip, I think that is a critically important point, that in an environment like this, don't be leveraged to the point of danger.
Mhm.
and have enough liquidity so you can get through a
Yep.
moment, a week, a month of danger. Those are important. Maybe you don't get as much interest on the liquid assets you've got, but you're more resilient if you have
Yes.
that liquidity, and you're less resilient if you have a lot of leverage. So I think in an environment like this where there's so much uncertainty, liquidity is critically important, as you've just pointed out. And I'm really quite impressed that you're thinking that way, because I
We,
think
we think about it all the time. I mean, given some of the portfolio investments we hold are in capital call structures where, in a volatile market, that is an opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity in all this. So these managers call capital at inopportune moments, potentially when markets are low or falling, and that's the time when they see opportunity. So we have to be liquid and be able to have portfolios that don't impact our clients' lives. Right? They can continue to do what they're doing, and we can continue to invest in a down cycle when there are actually good opportunities to be had in the public markets or the private markets, either way.
that's absolutely right. The opportunity is sort of developed in a bad market so that you can take advantage of it when
Yeah.
things turn around. And if you
Yeah.
have liquidity that you've not spent during a bad period, then when things start looking better, or you think things are looking better, then you have an opportunity to put that to work, to mobilize it. And you're also, one of the points you made, I think, is very important. Liquidity is there till it isn't.
Yeah.
I'll give you a good example of that. During the what was called the tequila crisis, this was decades ago, Mexico was AAA. It went from AAA to below investment grade in almost a week. And obviously, if you had Mexican paper in your portfolio, what you could sell when it was AAA was quite lucrative. When you went to non-investment grade, it was
Yeah.
very hard
Different story.
at all, if there were any market buyers at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm getting the nudge from our chief of staff, Phoebe Rubenstein, to begin the Q&A portion. Bob, again, I think the Q&A will be a great time for more discussion, but I speak for all of us at the firm and everyone on this call, how grateful we are for your time and your expertise, your experience, your insights. I don't think there's anyone in the world who has the breadth and knowledge of global trade that you have, and I think it's going to set up for a pretty interesting Q&A. I'm going to step aside and hand the reins over to Phoebe Rubenstein, who's going to take, it looks like we have a slew of questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but we're going to do the best we can and keep us on schedule.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. Thank you, Philip. So I'll get started and jump right in. The first one is, reflecting on past episodes of political and economic shock, what guidance would you offer policymakers and market participants in sustaining financial stability in the current environment?
I think what is critical is dialogue, is having conversations with the major players, your allies, and even countries that may not be your allies, but are major participants in the global financial system. I can go back to the time I was working for Kissinger. We went early on, this is the 70s, to see Mao Zedong. And we said, we really don't necessarily, because we're new, we hadn't talked to the Chinese in 20 years, 30 years. And we said, we don't fully understand China. And Mao said, we do. It was, the notion was they wanted to help us understand them, because they didn't want to have a financial crisis either.
Right.
So more and more there were conversations between the United States and China, so we would understand how they saw the world and they would understand how we did. So I think what we're going to need, and we don't have it now, I think the biggest deficit is not a trade deficit. The biggest deficit is a trust deficit. So at some point, we have to make sure that there are people in Paris, in Berlin, in London, and various other, in Beijing, in Delhi who understand us, who we know and who we can work with. No country has an interest in a financial crisis, but unless individuals know something about the other and know one another and have confidence in one another, it's very difficult to do. So my view would be that you start now by outlining the potential risks that are on the horizon or potentially on the horizon for the global system, and you start conversations about how to deal with them. In terms of individual companies, I think it's also important to identify what the potential risks are and what the potential ways of dealing with them are. And I think you need to have, if you read the report on the report on 9/11, it starts out, what we confronted here was a failure of imagination. And they weren't talking about Disneyland imagination. They were talking about that it was unimaginable that someone could come and blow up a building and two buildings in downtown New York. We couldn't even have imagined that. At this point, we have to look at not only the good horizons and the good potentials, but we have to look at what bad could happen and what we could do or might be able to do to deal with them. And I think that's extremely important. As sitting,
I just have to mention, Bob, that we appreciate your bringing up the 9/11 Commission report, because our esteemed advisory board member of Hollowbrook is Governor Thomas Kean, who I believe is on this call, who chaired the 9/11 Commission report, probably authored those very words. So that was not planned for webinar viewers, but it's great.
Hi, Tom. Good to see you.
Speaking of hardships in China, Bob, another question has come in that says, do you believe that the administration has miscalculated China's commitment to long-term strategic thinking and willingness to impose economic hardship on their own population?
That's a really interesting question. I think that there were a lot of people in the administration who did not think that China would be as resolute as they have been in resisting American pressure. The Chinese, and I was saying earlier, the Chinese don't negotiate the way we do. They have an environment where they clearly want to be seen as tough, as resolute, and not be pushed around by the United States. This is extremely important to Xi Jinping. When I had conversations with him, and this was beginning years ago, this notion of China standing up for its interests is critically important. They went through what they call 100 years of misery, where the foreigners were pushing them around. Foreigners took Hong Kong, various provinces of China, foreign influence in China during the Opium Wars. The Chinese have concluded that they cannot be pushed around by other countries because it leads to divisions in China and weakens them in the eyes of the world, and it weakens them in the eyes of their people. So the notion that Xi Jinping is going to call President Trump and sort of say, please give us the benefit of lower tariffs and all sorts of other things, it'd be a nice thought, but it's not in the way they see things. They're very resolute about the strength of China, the strength of the Communist Party, and the strength of the head of the Communist Party, who is Xi Jinping. And they are going, and he cannot, in terms of his own people, look weak. He cannot look as if he's pushed around by a foreign government or foreign power. And we have to recognize that. On the other hand, we do need to have a dialogue with them, but if we're going to have it, it's probably going to have to start out at least at a lower level and improve the understanding. What do they want? What do we want? And how do we get there? And I think there are areas where we could do it, in the area of pharmaceuticals, in the area of the environment. When I'll tell you a story. When Kissinger, who was 100 years old, was invited by Xi Jinping to visit him because there was a feeling by Kissinger and Xi that relations were deteriorating. And this was months and months and months ago. Kissinger said to him, yeah, I'll do this. I'll talk about strategic issues, but I want to spend half the time talking about AI. And it turned out, because both countries were trying to figure out how to deal with AI, and it turned out that there was substantial interest in AI by the Chinese and obviously by the U.S. to try to coordinate this. It's not that necessarily we're going to agree, because I think it's going to be very hard to reach agreement, but at least to understand what each side is doing. And in fact, following that up, there have been meetings in Geneva between American and AI and Chinese AI negotiators. So there are we've had a 100-year history of working with China on medical issues starting with the Rockefeller University. So there are areas where things could be done together. But I think we've got to figure those out and start them in the beginning as a way of building trust. And because we need them on medical issues and they need us. We need some of their drugs. They need some of ours.
So that's so interesting, Bob. And it's a perfect segue to two questions I'm going to combine into one. Does any particular sector come to mind which has a clear U.S.-centric benefit or clear U.S.-centric risk, which has not been already part of the public disclosure, auto, tech, pharma? And then the second, very similar, which industries, in addition to AI, are most important for U.S. economic vitality?
Well, let me do the latter because it's the easiest. And I think that it's semiconductors and all the things that derive from them, AI, quantum.
Interesting.
These new technologies, the Chinese want to be the preeminent power in that area, in part for economic reasons, but in part because it's so critical to their military strength. They want to have the military strength that they need in case there is some confrontation with the U.S. They don't want to be depending on the U.S. They want to be able to have their own facilities. They're putting huge amounts of money into this. They're putting huge amounts of money into their Navy. They're building their Navy at a rate that's maybe 30 or 40 times the rate at which we're building our Navy. So this notion of collaboration between corporations and the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, is enormous because they want to have enough power to deal with not just the United States, but any other country, and they're doing that. On the other hand, we don't want to depend on them for critical issues either, and semiconductors are one of them. Now, they're not as advanced as we are in some of them, but in some of them, as we've seen, they're moving ahead very rapidly. They're moving ahead. People were, for a while, a lot of Chinese were, in effect, surreptitiously taking American technology. But now they have people from all over the world coming to China. They're giving them labs, and they're giving them opportunities to make the technologies of the future. And let me just add one thought. That is, these cuts that are being made in the National Institutes of Health, in the national labs, in university research in this country, they're critical to the United States. They're critical to the economy of the United States. A lot of American companies depend on the early stage development of new technologies in research institutes, in the national labs, in NIH, in a whole range of similar institutions. And the rate of growth of research and development in American corporations is increasing quite dramatically. But the very early stage research that it's very hard to get private money into, a lot of it comes from within the government. If the government is cutting way back on these things, that very early stage research in vaccines and a whole range of things is not going to be available. And I think that in the long run, while we talk about tariffs, and tariffs are of benefit to some and are very harmful to others, over the long run, the lack of early stage R&D sponsored by the government or by government supported institutions like universities, the absence of that will probably hurt us more, because we need the race for preeminence in the 21st century in general is the race for preeminence in technology, in advanced technology. If we seem to be pulling back or are pulling back on the resources we devote to that, then it is going to weaken us, not just today and tomorrow, but for decades to come.
Right.
It's a very small part of the budget, but it is a very large portion of the economic and the military strength of the United States and the health of American citizens who depend on a lot of this early stage medical research.
Right.
A lot of that comes at the very early stages from the government.
So speaking of resources and domestic resources and spending particularly, we have a good question here. Can you comment on how the tariff policy in this period of uncertainty will impact the Federal Reserve as it relates to our monetary policy?
Yes, it's a very good question and very, very troubling in a way, because if you look at tariffs, they're bound to make the price of many things go up, both of consumer goods, that will go up. We're seeing that already because tariffed items or items subject to tariff are also components that auto companies and airplane companies and many other manufacturing companies around this country, they're needed by these companies. Steel, aluminum, we need those for a whole range of companies in this country. If all those prices go up, general inflation is going to go up. And in that environment, the Fed is going to be very cautious about lowering interest rates. And at the same time, the president is going to be saying, look, we want lower rates. We want to give the economy a boost. So people who, on that side of the equation are going to be leaning all over Jay Powell and the Federal Open Market Committee. And so I can see the potential for a very substantial conflict between the administration and the independent Federal Reserve, run by an independent head, which is currently Jay Powell. So I can see this being a big challenge. The Fed also, of course, has the mandate for employment and growth. So if you have the Fed facing higher interest rates or higher inflation, then you also have the Fed facing a situation where growth could be slowing down because people are paying these higher tariffs on imported goods. So the Fed is sort of in the middle of a very difficult spot, but it has to maintain, and the administration should make sure that it maintains independence, because if it gets to the point where the Fed seems to be taking orders from the administration, from whatever administration, but the Fed, since it's been created over 100 years ago, the Fed has been independent. And if it looks as if it's a political instrument rather than an independent instrument that is able to make judgments about inflation and about growth, then it looks like a number of other developing countries where central banks are politicized, and that would really cause a reaction in the market. If you politicize the Fed, if we're seen to be part of the political process rather than an independent agency, independent judgments on the basis of the best information it has, then it still maintains its credibility. So maintaining the credibility of the Fed as a non-political independent entity is extremely important. And I think that we have to bear that in mind when we think about relationships between the administration and the Federal Reserve Board.
Great, thank you. And this next one is the topic is no stranger to the Holbrook team. We talk about it all the time, but interested to see your perspective. Do you see as a reasonable expectation that foreign capital providers will pull back, leaving the U.S. with challenges financing our deficits and rolling over our debt?
Well, I do see that foreigners, in some cases, the dollar is still going to be the global reserve currency. I don't have any qualms about that. But I do think, just because we have the strongest, most liquid market, but if this market begins to fall apart, as we saw it almost did with respect to Fed rate, Treasury rates, and the dollar,
Right.
when they both weakened, when the Treasury was under pressure. This is just a week ago now, and the dollar was under pressure. It was because some countries that intuitively, instinctively, in a crisis situation would buy dollars and buy treasuries clearly weren't. Some of them were buying gold, some of them were putting their money somewhere else. This wasn't enough at that point to really hollow out the dollar or destroy the dollar as a world currency, but it does cause concerns about the stability of the dollar, particularly in a difficult environment. And I think this is one highly critical issue. The other is that we've used the dollar as leverage on a lot of countries. If they don't do what we want, we've used it in Iran, we've used it in Russia, we've used it in other countries. So their money that they keep in the U.S. and the Fed, especially for security purposes, they may say to themselves, well, this is really not our money. The Americans can interfere with our access to the banking system. They can interfere with SWIFT. Maybe the Americans are not as reliable as the banker to the world as they were in the past. And then countries could look for other avenues, gold being one, and more diversified currency holdings being another. But the role of the dollar, what de Gaulle called the exorbitant privilege, has been very beneficial to us, that we can borrow in dollars and countries will buy our bonds and buy our assets and buy our stocks and buy our bonds with our currency. If they lose confidence in our currency, that will undermine the credibility of our financial markets. So what was an exorbitant privilege in de Gaulle's eyes could turn into a serious problem if that level of confidence that we've seen in the dollar, and again, I'm not anticipating the dollar will not be the global currency, but there could be more doubts about holding dollars, and that could affect both the value of the dollar and the value of dollar-denominated assets, particularly treasury bonds, as we've seen already. We got a hint of this. It didn't go as far as to cause real damage in a permanent way, but it certainly caused short-term damage and certainly short-term questions about confidence going that could last for a long time.
Right.
I might just add to that your thoughts on the similar topic, but I'm surprised that the media has not really zeroed in on the enormous wall of treasury refinancings that the U.S. government is facing over the next 12 months. It's actually the next 36 months. We're going to be having, I believe it's close to, according to Jason Trennert, another Hollowbrook board member at Strategas, they've been looking at this very hard for years. And, separate of the tariff issues and who's president and, the modern moment, there's going to be between $9 and $10 trillion of treasuries that have to be refinanced over the next 12 months, call it, followed by another 5 trillion, followed by another 4 trillion. I mean, the last time I checked, a trillion's 1,000 billion. It's sort of a number that doesn't mean anything anymore, let alone 10 trillion. I mean, do you think that there's enough demand out there, separate of even the near-term noise about tariffs and how people may or may not feel about that or other countries, but there has to be a lot of appetite to buy up that many treasuries?
Philip, I think you're absolutely right. And to buy them up at a time when we're going to be adding more debt as a result of tax cuts and as a result of additional spending that's already more or less baked into the cake in this reconciliation bill, which seems to be inching its way through Congress. So the numbers over the next 10 years are going to be even greater. And so when you get refinancings by the federal government and refinancings by corporations who've borrowed at, say, 500 basis points and are now going to have to refinance at 700 basis points or 800 basis points. And then you add the people whose mortgages, they're going to have to refinance their mortgages or take out new mortgages. So you get a huge demand for dollar-denominated assets. And the question is, are there going to be buyers? And the other question is, if there are buyers, at what price? So my guess is that Treasury auctions will be more and more difficult to sustain, and that refinancings by corporations will be more and more difficult to execute. And then over a period of time, we have to realize that if you look at the contingent obligations of the Social Security system, the Medicare system, and part of the Medicaid system, part state, part federal, those numbers are going to be enormous as more people retire. There are going to be more and more calls, and these are only in Treasury. These are in Treasury bills and Treasury notes, and so that adds another weight to the Treasury's requirements. Now,
yeah.
To me, this is a serious problem, and I think companies and government officials who are thinking about the future ought to look out over the horizon, as I mentioned earlier, and see what those numbers look like and try to envisage and prepare for much higher either shortages in buyers or a higher demand for interest payments on the Treasury assets or the corporate assets that they purchase. So I think that is going to be an enormous problem. And then you get contingent liabilities of the federal government for other things. And other governments in Europe, there are huge contingent liabilities for government workers. Governments would say, well, we can't pay you now, but we'll pay you later and we'll pay you more. So they create contingent liabilities for themselves. So I think the world, now that they aren't all in dollars, they're in euros and other currencies. But if you look at the availability of money versus the obligations of governments, of corporations to do refinancing or pay off contingent liabilities, then those numbers become enormous. And I don't think we have thought through those at all. And we're going to have to deal with them. It'll come up, one would hope, in the debates over the reconciliation bill. But if you look at it from a generational point of view, it means that we're shifting a huge amount of these obligations to children and grandchildren.
Yes.
Politicians now are not paying the money off now, but are shifting it to another group of people who might be in power 10 years from now or 20 years.
Yeah.
Bob,
Phoebe, how are we on time?
Yes, we are just closing on time, Bob. I can't tell you we have so many questions that have rolled in, over 35 questions, and we can't nearly get to any more of them in our allotted time, just to be respectful, but quite the evidence of an engaging conversation. So I'm going to stop us here and thank you so much for your time and your insights in this amazing conversation and allowing our Hollowbrook community to ask questions and hear your perspective on these topics. And I want to just say that if anybody that is listening would like to follow up with Hollowbrook or with Bob, to please reach out to me, and I'm happy to make the introduction. Bob is an open door. And Philip, if you have any closing remarks, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in, and Bob, for your time today. It's incredibly appreciated.
It's my pleasure working with the Hollowbrook team, a bunch of really good people, really good professionals who keep their eye on these issues and think about them and try to advise in the best way they can in a currently unstable environment and in my judgment, in a very thoughtful and a very serious way. And I feel a lot of confidence working with them and dealing with almost an unprecedented period of time. And I couldn't think of a better group of people to work with in this environment.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Bob, thank you for the kind words, and I want to thank all of our viewers for joining, and we hope to do further webinars in the future, and hope you'll join us again. Bob, thank you.